So let's begin tonight's class on minds and mental factors with page 73, reciting the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. Then either 97 or 98 for the short mandala offering, depending on the version of the prayer book you have. And then we'll do, as usual, the offering mantra after we read that verse in English, and then refuge and bodhicitta, once in English, twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryata Yami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chunyan gi pesonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyab suchi Daki chunyan gi sonam gi drola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, you can set the prayer books aside and let's do a short meditation before we begin. Spending the first few minutes in focused meditation on the breath to calm the mind. And then I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation for this evening's class. So before we begin the class, let's just take a moment to adjust our motivation. So the mind of bodhicitta is greatly informed by compassion and love for beings. And those two thoughts are generated on the basis of observing sentient beings and seeing their situation. There is not a single being in samsara that we can look at and say that they are free from suffering, although they desire to be free. It's also not a being that we can look at and say that they've attained true peace and happiness, although that is also a part of their deepest desire. So when we observe sentient beings, countless sentient beings who are in this state of conditioned existence, we recognize very clearly that their situation is really no different from our own. Moreover, we recognize that we have met with the teachings that provide the ability to be free from suffering, to find true peace. And motivated by the love and compassion observing sentient beings in this way, we would want nothing more than to free them all, to bring them to that state. But we see that we're simply incapable. We can benefit sentient beings to a degree in this lifetime, but not to the degree that we would like. As Lama Yeshe says, one of the most painful things about our existence is we can't help sentient beings to the degree that we want to. Bodhicitta is the answer to that. Motivated by trying to accomplish the welfare of all beings, we see that we have to become enlightened in order to do that. So the primary aim is to benefit others, but the secondary aim is to become a Buddha to do that. So cultivate that mind now so that everything we do becomes a cause for that result as it is influenced by that motivation. In this way, our study of the mind will provide unbelievable benefits for both ourselves and all sentient beings. Okay. So I'm going to be very ambitious tonight and try to get through the virtuous mental factors, but we'll see how far we make it. There's no promises or guarantees on that. In the last session, we were working with the mental factor that's called effort or enthusiasm. This is the 7th of the 11 virtuous mental factors. So we have a few to go through. We are not quite done with effort. It has a longer section, and we were on page 43. Having just finished going through these various 5 types of efforts that were set out from the Compendium of Knowledge. So any questions up to this point? So we're at the paragraph that starts there that says the function of effort is specified as thoroughly fulfilling and fully accomplishing the class of virtue, because the entire class of virtue is contingent upon effort. So again, this is just what we were emphasizing last time, is that effort is quite essential. Remember that effort is one of the factors that is set out in terms of our way of overcoming our laziness, in terms of developing calm abiding, shamatha, meditative stabilization. But nonetheless, effort is needed for everything that we're doing on the path. And this isn't worldly effort. This is, again, this effort that is engaged in the pursuit of virtue, the counteracting non-virtue, and so on. So it says there, along these lines, the exhortation to the exceptional resolve says, by making effort, nothing whatsoever, whether created in this world or created beyond this world, is difficult to gain. That being the case, through the force of effort, what wise person would become weary? Those who are set on the enlightenment of Buddhahood, having seen the faults of lethargy and sleep, constantly dwell in making effort. Thus, this I have exhorted them to do. So this is an exhortation to us then as well, to recognize that the only way we're going to accomplish Buddhahood is by having effort, by making this enthusiastic, joyous perseverance in our practice. We can see there's challenges to doing this nonetheless, but um, it becomes easier over time. As Master Shantideva says, I use this verse frequently, there's nothing whatsoever that doesn't become easier through the force of familiarity. So the more that we engage in it, the easier it becomes. It's just something we have to keep in mind. And if we really, again, recall that in that schema of looking at the fault of laziness, that effort is the third of those antidotes. It's preceded by aspiration, which we talked about earlier, which is preceded by faith, which we also talked about earlier. So we see that in order for us to have effort, we need to have an aspiration to what we're trying to achieve. And where does that aspiration come from? Through that faith or confidence that we have in the Buddha's teachings. And then from those, again, in the schema that leads to overcoming our laziness, the next one is pliancy. And pliancy is actually coming up as the very next mental factor. So we'll see kind of how that plays a role in terms of completing the overcoming of the fault of laziness in our meditative practice. But nonetheless, again, effort is needed for all of these qualities that we're going to develop on the path. Then there's some quotes from Maitreya's ornament for the Mahayana Sutras. Among the host, let's read this together tonight. Among the host of virtues, effort is supreme. In dependence on it, one obtains the other virtues. Through effort, one obtains immediately a supreme state of happiness and the mundane and supramundane attainments. Through effort, one obtains the desirable resources of cyclic existence. Through effort, one possesses outstanding purity. Through effort, one becomes freed by transcending the transitory collection. Through effort, one awakens to supreme enlightenment. So again, I think I don't need to make much commentary on that. It's saying many of the same things that we've already emphasized around effort, that this is really the way in which we accomplish everything. Things don't just fall into our laps, unfortunately. We can't just make that aspiration and suddenly have them materialize. That from aspiration, we need to feed into that effort, that enthusiasm for our practice. On the top of page 44, then, it says, thus, since all excellent qualities follow upon effort, the method to generate effort is extremely important. In regard to this method, if you were to carefully analyze and understand the knowledge passages cited above, the Abhidharma passages we've looked at, the techniques for generating effort will appear very extensive. Nevertheless, it is difficult for those of inferior intellect such as I to understand how to produce effort in dependence on just those. Hence, it is of utmost importance to know the following in accordance with the foremost omniscient Tsongkhapa's great exposition of the stages of the path, the Lamrim Chenmo. So again, keep this in mind that frequently he will cite the Lamrim Chenmo, and it is good to go to passages that are related to this topic, which you will find in volume 2 of the English version, the Bodhisattva Path, and you'll find them in the Perfection of Joyous Effort, which is the fourth of the 6 perfections. So first, the benefits of making effort. I'm not going to talk about a lot of these, but the benefits of making effort, the disadvantages of not doing so. That's kind of like the advertising that's done frequently for the Lamrim topics. You get all these amazing benefits if you take it, and if you don't, you're going to have all these detrimental things go on. Then the way in which it stops its discordant class, the laziness of procrastination, the adherence to unwholesome activities, and indolence. So these are, again, types of laziness that we talked about in the last class, and we'll get to laziness when we get to the delusions, the secondary afflictions. Oh, okay. Okay. So then the fourth point there, the fourth bullet says the way to practice the favorable conditions for effort, what are called the 4 powers, the power of belief, the power of steadfastness, the power of joy, and the power of abandonment. So I actually thought it was worthwhile to at least take a brief look at these. Again, we're not going to have a lot of time to go through all of it, but I'm doing the share screen now with the folks online. Hopefully they're there, yeah. So that was just a list of the 11 that we're going through. So the 4 powers are also explained in Lama Tsongkhapa's middle-length Lamrim. Again, this is the text that Geshe-la will start to teach in 2 weeks here. So page 175, if you want to look it up and see, that's the section that pertains particularly to right around those pages to effort. The power of belief. The power of belief is to meditate on causes and effects so as to generate the aspiration to discard and adopt. So we see that, again, this belief or conviction in things does contribute to our effort. That as long as we have a clear view of what things are and have a real conviction in causes and effects, because once more, the whole law of cause and effect plays a role in our entire path. If you want the effect, the result of enlightenment, you have to create the causes. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You are never going to attain enlightenment without that. So the effort we put into the path is greatly influenced by the power of our belief. Secondly, the power of stability, which that's the translation term that's used in middle length Lamrim. Here we had steadfastness. The power of stability is not to engage in anything haphazardly without investigating it and having investigated it to engage in it and culminate it. So this is what we're all doing here: is continually investigating the path to enlightenment and coming to an understanding that it is something that we can attain. And then, having investigated in that way, we have to engage in it and culminate it. And of course, it doesn't mean that we have to do the entire path in one fell swoop. This is why the Lamrim is divided into topics. This is why there's many different things that we can practice. But we have to bring those things to conclusion, in a sense, culminate each of them. When we study something, study it well, try to integrate it into our lives well, not just kind of go around from topic to topic and doing this and doing that and thinking there's going to be, the effect, but rather this ability to stay with something, to be steadfast in one's effort. The third one is the one that we brought up last week as well, the power of joy. That this is meant to be, again, a joyous experience. We're moving towards the greatest possible outcome for both ourselves and others. The power of joy makes your undertaking of joyous effort uninterrupted and insatiable, like a child engaged in a game, or even adults engaged in a game. This Friday, right? So, if you've seen children play, again, I was always amazed. My brother would play by himself for, hours and hours when he was even, I was quite taken with it. I wasn't that entertaining of myself or something. I couldn't keep myself going in that way. But some children will play and just have this amazing joy, in just whatever they're doing, building this and destroying that and whatever. So, but joy is really important. And then this one's called, in some texts, even the power of relinquishment. But in the translation of the middle length Lamrim, it's called the power of suspension, which is kind of a strange term to me. But abandonment is the term that we had in our text. The power of suspension is to rest when your body and your mind are worn out due to your joyous effort. As soon as you have recovered, you start again. It's not like checking out completely. There's no real rest until we get to enlightenment, I guess, and then we're resting in that state. But it is important to relinquish the work at times, to recognize that it does take the long view and the ability to kind of keep our sights set on the longer goals, but to continually tend to ourselves and make sure that we're not kind of overdoing it in that way. So any questions on those four? Again, you can find a lot more about them in the middle length Lamrim, and even in of course, in the other texts, the great treatise, and Geshe Sopa's commentary on that. So I don't know that I need to do any more of those slides. Let me stop the share because we're going to go to the text. Any questions or comments then on effort? Let's go on to pliancy then. Oh, it says here, since I cannot mention everything here, you should understand them by carefully pursuing, engaging in the bodhisattva deeds as well as the great treatise, the great exposition. So again, know that there's an entire chapter of Shantideva's text, chapter 7, which is devoted to joyous effort, 6 having been devoted to patience, and 8 to meditation. So it's, anyway. Pliancy. Pliancy in some texts is called actually agility, but I guess a more common translation of this term is suppleness. Let's go through what this is, because it's not something that we maybe talk about that much in our culture, but regarding pliancy, the Compendium of Knowledge says, what is pliancy? It is a serviceability of body and mind due to severing the continuum of unfavorable states of body and mind. It has the function of eliminating all obscurations. So this is again, what we're talking about here in terms of this mental factor is mental pliancy. But there is an accompanying physical pliancy that occurs. So you all will recall that I've talked about the process that many of you are already familiar with, that's set out in the Lamrim in the 5th perfection, the perfection of concentration or meditation, where it is explained how you go through the 9 mental abidings to achieve the state of calm abiding. You don't get this state of fully qualified pliancy until you achieve calm abiding, and it's actually one of the signs of having achieved calm abiding, is this serviceability of body and mind. So as you go through developing that level of meditative stabilization, you will see again the refinement, and it's all set out in the text as to what the demarcation is between each of those stages. A refinement of your stability of mind, your concentration, your meditation, until you achieve this very focused mind. That's at the ninth level. You're able to abide somewhat single-pointedly, but you haven't yet achieved this pliancy. And that's, again, really the demarcation of having moved into attaining calm abiding. So I'll talk about that again in a little bit, but let me go ahead and continue with the text. But this idea of it being a serviceability, they say that again, your body becomes sort of light as cotton. You don't have any sort of tension that will be an obstacle to your path. Your mind is also extremely serviceable, can move from one object to another. Yeah, Bob, were you going to share something? Yeah, yeah, right, right. That's, I guess, Bob's just pointing out that until you achieve it, it's kind of hard to know exactly what we're talking about. And it does sound very wonderful, but it's hard to put words on what that must be like to have a body that is completely serviceable. I mean, now our bodies, when we sit down to meditate, it's like all the little aches and pains eventually show up, you know. And so, you know, at least for me, I don't know about all of you. Maybe you all have calm abiding already, but so, so again, this is something that we can aim for and be very inspired hearing about, you know, what this is like to have this. So let's go through how it's described. It says, just as it has been said above, it is a knower that deposits an imprint so that the mind can be applied however one wishes to a virtuous object of observation, and that severs the continuum of unfavorable states of body and mind. So it's like I like this idea of calling it's a serviceability. Your mind is serviceable. Then you know you can do what you want with it. You can pursue whatever virtuous topic that you wish, and we are all going to need to have this, you know, to be able to achieve these realizations, because you need to bring that mind of calm abiding in union with special insight. Remember this term, the union of calm abiding and special insight, that is a platform for all of our realizations in terms of especially the direct realization of emptiness, but even prior to that. So then it says, when divided, pliancy itself is of two types, physical pliancy and mental pliancy. Physical pliancy is such that through the power of meditative stabilization, unserviceability of the body is purified, whereupon the body is buoyant and light like a ball of cotton and can be applied to virtuous activity according to one's wish. Mental pliancy, top of page 45, is such that through the power of meditative stabilization, the mind becomes free of unserviceability, whereupon it becomes amenable to application to an object of observation without hindrance. So I'm going to show some slides in a moment from Geshe Rabten that talks about this, but I thought while I was on this topic, I'd share just a little bit of what's in Geshe Loden's Lamrim text, where he talks about the criterion of having attained calm abiding. So this is at the very end of the section on shamatha, on calm abiding, and the fifth the fifth perfection in the great scope. He says, once you have gained the ninth mental stage, you are able to concentrate for as long as you wish, simply by deciding the period for which you want to meditate and then beginning the session. This, however, is not the realization of calm abiding. This is what I mentioned earlier. Calm abiding is attained when you gain a complete pliancy of body and mind after having attained the ninth mental stage. The special bliss of pliancy is gained by familiarizing yourself again and again with the effortless single-pointed concentration of the ninth stage. So you repeatedly go into that meditative stabilization that is at the ninth stage. It says, some may quickly gain the experience of blissful pliancy, but others may need to meditate for several weeks after attaining the ninth stage before they are able to induce pliancy. The bliss that arises from this mental and physical pliancy is greater than any other pleasure of cyclic existence. At the beginning of the ninth stage, there's a slight experience of pliancy which increases until mental pliancy is generated. The winds or subtle energies that are involved in unsalutary physical states are calmed and leave the body through the top of the head, where a feeling of bliss is generated. This mental pliancy overcomes mental rigidity, and there's a pacification of all unsalutary states that make the mind heavy and prevent it being used for virtue. Mental pliancy then causes a wind that induces physical pliancy to circulate throughout the body, removing any sense of physical roughness and heaviness. The body becomes light, healthy, and tireless, and can be used at will for virtuous actions. In dependence on this, a bliss of physical pliancy is generated, having the aspect of a very pleasant smoothness, flexibility, and lightness. Continued concentration will then generate a bliss of mental pliancy, where the body seems to dissolve into the object of concentration and no other phenomena appear. So it's sort of like you get the physical pliancy that induces the mental pliancy, that induces the physical bliss, which then induces the mental bliss, is I think what was being said here in essence. Um, it says the mind becomes so buoyantly blissful that it loses some of its capacity to remain on the object of concentration. When this bliss is stabilized a little, you gain an immovable pliancy whereby the mind remains perfectly on the object of concentration. At this point, you have attained calm abiding. Your mind is extremely clear, and it is as if you can count the atoms in a wall. Upon the attainment of calm abiding, your mind is transformed. I don't know if you need to say much more about this. And it goes on to talk about all the things that you gain on the basis of that. But it's kind of nice to give kind of a little more detail about what that process is like. Again, that you go into the winds moving, and so um, inducing this sort of diminishment of the unsalutary physical states, and then a bit of a feeling of bliss that you generate on the crown of the head, and then the mental pliancy overcoming any of our mental rigidity. And so I don't know, right? That is Geshe Lodin's book called The Path to Enlightenment in Tibetan Buddhism. Very expensive book, unfortunately. I was able to get one from somebody from Australia who, because it's produced in Australia. So let's go to the slides and get some information from that. Geshe Rabtin's way of sharing this. Okay, so he calls it suppleness. And he says suppleness is a distinct mental factor that has the effect of enabling the mind to apply itself to a wholesome object in whatever manner it wishes, as well as interrupting any mental and physical rigidity. It has the function of purifying mental and physical rigidity and acts as a basis for all meditations directly associated with mental quiescence, which is another name for calm abiding, and penetrative insight or special insight. So shamatha and vipassana in the Sanskrit. And oops, yeah, the five faults. Yeah, I just inserted this so you can see once more what I was saying earlier about the four antidotes to the first fault of laziness, that you don't really completely overcome your laziness. It's kind of, I don't know, reassuring maybe in some ways until you get pliancy. Pliancy is the final antidote by which you then will never kind of have any obstacle of laziness, because the mind will instantly go into whatever it is that you want to meditate on. You're physically and mentally, completely manageable. No obstacles then in terms of laziness. Mental and physical rigidity, Geshe Rabtin says, is an inept state of mind or body in which one is incapable of doing what one wishes. It is a seed that gives rise to all forms of afflictions. Suppleness overcomes any heaviness and rigidity and makes the mind very flexible and quick. One is thus enabled to use the mind in whatever way one wishes, whether to solve an intellectual problem or to concentrate upon an object of meditation. Through practice, this quality can also be developed in the body, giving one a sense of extreme physical lightness and well-being, as though one were floating in air. The suppleness of body, though, is only a specific form of tactile sensation and is thus not to be considered as this wholesome mental factor. Likewise, it should be noted that suppleness only refers to the supple quality of mind that refers to wholesome objects. And I suppose you could use your suppleness of mind to observe unwholesome objects, but nonetheless, it's intended to be used to help us to create virtue, to explore virtue, to investigate virtue. So I think that's all the slides I had on that particular mental factor from other texts. So any questions on any of that? One thing I'll mention, I've heard, other people have heard Venerable Rene say this. I can't remember who it was that told me this, but he's done a lot of meditation, and I think has Maybe he's accomplished calm abiding, I don't know, but he's accomplished certainly some very deep meditative states. And he said that when you get to even the fourth of the 9 levels of the mental abidings, it's already something like beyond anything you've experienced in terms of this life, way more pleasurable. You can see why you can almost get not quite an addiction, but a bit of an attachment to the wonderful feelings that you have in meditation. It can be very enticing. But to recognize again that meditation in this tradition is really just a tool. Meditative stabilization is to help us to achieve realizations. It's a platform, a basis. It's not something that we want to just hang out and then say, oh, this is just wonderful. I feel great. So, but it can be refreshing, I'm sure, to have those little, much better than a shower, I'm sure. All right, more on page 45. Let's finish off this section. Moreover, the foremost Lama Tsongkhapa says in his Song of Experience, a very short Lamrim text, concentration is a king. Let's read this together. Concentration is a king ruling the mind. When placed in it, the mind is as immovable as the king of mountains. When employed, it engages all virtuous objects of observation and induces the great bliss of serviceable body and mind. So this is just an encapsulation of everything that's presented in the section on calm abiding in most Lamrim texts. It's a very, again, important part of our practice. Its function is specified as eliminating all obscurations, because through the force of pliancy, all unfavorable states of body and mind will be purified, and upon attaining pliancy, meditative stabilization, having been roused from within, will increase. Simply through this increase, the bliss of pliancy will increase. Due just to this increase, meditative stabilization will increase. Therefore, the mind will be empowered to overcome obscuration. So it's not to say that this mind in and of itself, eliminates obscurations, but it is through the force of it that we are able then to eliminate obscurations by realizing emptiness directly and so on. But nonetheless, we have to say that having that state of mind does disallow many non-virtuous states of mind from arising, because the mind is so calm that we aren't agitated by things that would normally agitate us, and drawn towards things that would normally excite us, because we've already diminished those, kind of made them non-manifest in the mind, those sorts of things. So there's great pacification of the afflictions that has already occurred, but not the complete elimination until we have a union of that with special insight in a non-conceptual way, observing emptiness or selflessness. So any final questions on pliancy, Bob, or comments? Uh-huh. Right, yeah. Right, right. Mhm. Yeah, right. Bob's comment was about the fact that meditators frequently don't need to sleep. There's these reports and things, and what is that attributable or linked up to this mental and physical pliancy? And I would say yes. And they also often even talk about the idea of the food of concentration, that you actually kind of sustain the body through your concentration. It's kind of a bit radical. I don't know that what Western scientists would think about this idea, but it doesn't seem that you need much sustenance physically when you have that ability. So yes, I think that the food thing, the sleep thing, all of that is kind of related to the fact that you've attained that state where the body is able to be, not in need of a lot of the things that we normally need in our coarser state of mind and body. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, they do say that Rinpoche never used to sleep. Lama Zopa, that he would be up, and it doesn't seem that even when he sleeps, I think he does tend to sit in meditation. I don't know. I don't have direct knowledge of any of this stuff. I'm just what I've heard. Any other comments? All right, we're going to go on then to number 9, conscientiousness. It's kind of interesting in the translation. that actually it's from this one that Artemis Engel did, the larger book that's on Vasubandhu's 5 aggregates, summary of the 5 aggregates. They called this one mindfulness, and then they called mindfulness volition. So it's just kind of interesting. Conscientiousness does have a bit of the mindfulness sort of thing in the way that we sometimes talk about mindfulness in our tradition. But just keep that in mind that there can be, most texts will use conscientiousness, but you may see some texts that translate it as that. What is conscientiousness? It is a cultivation of virtuous qualities within abiding in non-attachment, non-hatred, non-ignorance, as well as effort, and guards the mind against contaminations. It has the function of thoroughly completing and fully establishing all mundane and supermundane success. So it's kind of interesting. We might start looking at it and thinking that it sounds somewhat similar to maybe even like our, well, it's got a flavor of effort to it to some degree, but it's also got that idea of kind of keeping us on track. And we already talked about 2 virtuous mental factors that do that, right? The self-respect and consideration for others. So there is a difference between those in terms of both of those are really about avoiding non-virtue, whereas conscientiousness can be there when we're avoiding non-virtue, but it also is about our engagement in virtue. It's about, fulfilling whatever it is that we need to do at the moment. It's a cultivation of virtuous qualities, which can be, again, moving towards creating more wholesome activities versus avoiding what is unwholesome. These 3 are mentioned: non-attachment, non-hatred, non-ignorance, that we looked at previously. These 3 that we might call the root virtues, because they're the opposite of the 3 root afflictions. It doesn't mean that all 3 necessarily have to be present. We could have probably one of those present rather than all 3. But as I said, it also is linked up with effort. So if you have any of those 3 or any combination of those 3 and effort, it seems that your conscientiousness will probably be abiding together with those. It guards the mind against contaminations, kind of keeps us from having unwholesome states of mind and so on. It has that function of thoroughly completing and fully establishing both the mundane and supermundane success. Again, supermundane is everything that happens on the basis of a direct realization of emptiness and beyond that, whereas everything that's mundane is prior to that, though we can still have, I guess, some mundane qualities we develop after directly realizing emptiness. But so then the sentence that's following says, just as it has been said above, it is an awareness that accomplishes virtue within abiding in effort, without coming under the influence of afflictions, and it guards the mind against contaminations. So you can see some flavor of mindfulness to it. Why the translator, Artemis Engel, I think it was in that book, who translated it as mindfulness, because it is not just the mindfulness that is holding us to an object. It is a mindfulness that is influenced to engage in virtuous deeds and engage in virtuous activity. So let me go ahead and show the slides that speak a little bit more about this from Geshe Rabtin's point of view. Let me do the screen share for the folks online. And the very first slide is his definition of this. He says, conscientiousness is a distinct mental factor that cherishes the accumulation of what is wholesome and guards the mind against that which gives rise to affliction. So it's kind of doing both things in a sense, keeping us moving forward in virtue, keeping us from falling back into non-virtue. It is a quality ascribed to a state of mind in which detachment or non-attachment, non-hatred, and non-ignorance or non-bewilderment and enthusiasm or effort are present. Again, we have to get different translation equivalents for these mental factors. It performs the function of bringing to fulfillment and forever maintaining all that is good, both within and beyond this world. So very similar, just different words, but same essence of what we just looked at in the definition. Afflictions can arise both from internal as well as external conditions. Conscientiousness protects us from reacting in a negative way towards external conditions, and thus prevents the mind from being overwhelmed by attachment, hatred, and so forth. So it's kind of this force of the mind, if you will, that kind of keeps us on track. In guarding the mind, it is similar in some ways to the 2 that I mentioned earlier, that are the virtuous mental factor of self-respect or shame, self-concern, what have you, and or what was the self-respect? Pardon? self-regard, maybe that's a good way. I think maybe those are I can't remember all the translations that we had for that one, but and consideration for others. Consideration for others we called embarrassment, right? But the idea is that it's kind of similar to both of those, except that it is not based on a particular reason. Rather, it is a more fundamental protective quality. However much we try to develop wholesome and positive qualities, we will not succeed if we lack the quality of conscientiousness. And again, I think it was Geshe Tenzin Temple that pointed out that it's not just for avoiding non-virtue, but also for creating virtue. So there are differences between self-respect and consideration for others and conscientiousness, because conscientiousness can be used in both ways. One more slide, I think. Living an unconscientious existence is comparable to being spiritually dead, since any opportunity for cultivating virtue is automatically squandered. Living with conscientiousness, though, is equivalent to having found immortality. Okay, so you know, so we see again, these are just keeping in mind that all 11 of these virtuous mental factors are conceptually cultivated. They're not like they're going to naturally arise in some sort of, you know, way in the mind. They have to be induced. And so, again, we see that there are many factors that induce our having more conscientiousness. A lot of what we study in the Lam Rim is to help us to have that, right? To be much more conscientious in our behavior and in what we're doing. Yeah. So, like to not take for granted the this life and understand the impermanence of this life, and to understand that we could end up in an unfortunate state if we aren't conscientious with this life. So a lot of our Lam Rim teachings kind of inform us having that. Yeah, Bob. Yeah, Bob was saying it sounds like a farmer of virtue. So yeah, it's definitely things we cultivate, and we have to create all the again causes and conditions for that and tend to them. Um, Let me go ahead and go through the next slide, which is kind of very different from what we're going to see in our text. And I can't give much commentary on these because Geshe Rabdin just introduced them, and I can't find them in any other text. But in his presentation that he did in The Mind and Its Functions, it says there are 4 kinds of conscientiousness. Conscientiousness in accumulating merit. Obviously, we need to have that. We need to be very conscientious to not miss opportunities to accumulate merit. And we have Rinpoche at least advises us to take advantage of the various Buddhist holidays through the year where we have all these auspicious conditions coming together too. We have one coming up at the end of May, just about a month from now, with Sakadawa on May 29th. So just good to have that in your mindset that if there's an opportunity to accumulate merit, you want to do it. Conscientiousness in the attainment of liberation. Obviously, for those who are intent upon liberation, that this is something that's important for them to have. Conscientiousness in developing renunciation, which would even precede the attainment of liberation or the desire for liberation. And conscientiousness in cultivating uncontaminated virtue. Uncontaminated, once more, is a reference to those virtuous states that are together with the wisdom directly realizing emptiness. Contaminated means it's still together with the ignorance that doesn't realize emptiness, it realizes the opposite or thinks of the opposite. And uncontaminated virtue would be all the virtue that is together with that wisdom. Now, why these 4 are delineated, it's kind of strange to me because that's why I don't have any commentary on these 4, because they don't seem like they're, you know, whereas like the conscientiousness and attainment of enlightenment, I mean, maybe that's included in liberation. I don't know. It's always hard to say. Yeah, Bob. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah, Bob was just reiterating that these can be seen as kind of milestones on our path to enlightenment, things that we need to accomplish that create a more joyous state of engaging in virtue. But yeah, I just don't know that they're quite inclusive of everything, but I suppose you could, I mean, if you expand the attainment of liberation to be not just liberation, but also enlightenment, but the term liberation was used here, but I don't know. Let's go ahead and go to the text then. Let me stop the screen share for the people who are online. And we go through a different division, 5 types that are from Asanga's Bodhisattva grounds. Conscientiousness with respect to the former, to the latter, to the middle, then conscientiousness prior to activity, and conscientiousness of concordant application. By the way, there were better translations for these in Vincent Montenegro's translation of that's available online, or you can get it through Amazon and that. But I didn't bring it with me, so we're gonna have to struggle with the translation of this terminology. But if you go to the next page, it's kind of hard. We'll go through them one by one. Conscientiousness with respect to the former is the correction of past faults in accordance with the Dharma. So you're kind of looking at it and you're saying, okay, what have I done in the past that I need to be somewhat conscientious about making sure that I tend to, and not just let that stuff sit there, because once more that's going to have its results. If we had a very non-virtuous past, well then we have to purify that stuff. We have to tend to it. We have to take care of it. We have to be correcting it. It means we have to stop engaging it in the future, and of course engage in purification of those past actions. Conscientiousness with respect to the latter is an earnest intention to do so in the future. It's kind of strange, latter. But anyway, the idea is that you can have it with regard to the past, you can have it with regard to the future, in terms of wanting to, do virtuous deeds and so on in the future. The third one is with respect to the middle, which is the present, doing so without forgetfulness in the present. So those three are pretty easy to understand. They're just the three times, tending to having a conscientiousness around our past actions, our present actions, and then our future actions. Number 4, which was called here conscientiousness prior to activity, before acting. It says here it's described as a tightening of the mind, thinking how wonderful it would be if I could behave and abide in ways such that faults do not arise. So maybe it's like a preemptory kind of conscientiousness, kind of preempts our engagement in non-virtue by having that strong, by tightening of the mind. They don't mean an unhealthy tightening. They mean a firmness of mind, right? The mind is quite firm in that conscientiousness. The final one, conscientiousness of concordant application. I can't remember the term that the other translation used. In dependence on that, behaving and abiding accordingly. But it's kind of like it's what follows from the fourth one. So you have the firmness of the mind that says I'm going to remain conscientious in what I'm doing and not fall into non-virtue. And then you have the concordant application of that in terms of your actions. So in dependence upon that fourth one, behaving and abiding accordingly. So it's kind of like the sort of motivation that gets you going in that direction, and then maintaining it through what you do. So then it says, since it has been taught that it has the function of acting as a support for achieving all mundane and supermundane success. Of course, all of these seem like they act as a support for those goals, but it is of utmost importance as the root of all paths and grounds. And we hear a lot of these being called the root too, but we see the importance of so many of these virtuous mental factors. And this is the thing to keep in mind, is you don't practice just one of these at a time. Frequently you have many of them present at the same time, because they're uniting in their force to produce more powerful virtue. Then it says, thus the protector Nagarjuna also says in his letter to a friend, let's read this together. The Muni taught that conscientiousness is the source of the nectar of immortality, and non-conscientiousness that of death. Therefore, for the sake of enhancing your virtuous qualities, respectfully always be conscientious. So this is what we saw again in the slide, was that this idea of kind of it's the source of our immortality, kind of allows us to continue to engage in virtue. Any comments on that one? Uh-huh. Mm, well, you could have accumulating merit. You're talking about the three that follow after the first one, of accumulating merit. Then there's the path of preparation, path of seeing. No, accumulation is first, and then preparation. Um, let's go back to this. Yeah. So the comments that have been shared, just to share with folks online, had to do with this list of 4 and whether these are correlated in any way with the 4 learning paths path of accumulation, preparation, seeing, and meditation that precede the fifth path, the path of no more learning, which is the result. But yeah, I don't know that they can be directly correlated. The first one, obviously, is quite a bit of what we're doing in the first of the five paths, path of accumulation. But I don't know. You're accumulating merit throughout your whole path. Throughout all five, although until you get to the fifth one, you need three great countless eons of merit to make it through all the various, levels. So anyway, it would be speculating to say what some of these are. I think, in terms of, but obviously they are all important. I mean, we can't say that, there could be other things added to the list, is my perspective, that aren't on the list, but it doesn't mean that we aren't conscientious with regard to them. They're just maybe included in here implicitly. Yeah, Bob. Yeah. Well, it would be everything that, yeah. Bob's wondering if in attaining enlightenment, if it's included in cultivating uncontaminated virtue. Well, yeah, it's a culmination certainly of all of our uncontaminated virtue. But the cultivation of uncontaminated virtue is also what gets us to achieve the path of seeing and continue on the path of meditation and so on. But I don't know. Yeah. So Jane says maybe they restricted it to four, so there'd be something for all the other mental factors to do. So can let them have a piece of the pie. Yeah. Conscientiousness didn't want to get greedy. So, okay. So let's continue on, see how we can do. Maybe we can at least get through these two remaining ones. There is a little bit of a section that goes into virtue, a whole discussion of virtue for about 2 pages. But um, equanimity. Regarding equanimity, the Compendium of Knowledge says, what is equanimity? It is a discordance with afflictive states, an evenness of mind, a dwelling in a natural state, and a spontaneous abiding in non-attachment, non-hatred, non-ignorance, as well as effort. So we see those 4 being mentioned here. They were mentioned earlier in regard to the where was that? That was in conscientiousness, right? The previous one, where we saw those 4. And then it goes on to say it has the function of not allowing an opportunity for afflictions. So let's go through a bit of this. I'm going to come back and talk about what equanimity is again after we've gone through a little bit more. It says, just as it has been said above, in dependence on the techniques for internally setting the mind single-pointedly on an object of observation, the 9 mental abidings are gradually accomplished. This is once more one of these mental factors that's very much caught up in our meditative stabilization, the practice of that, developing calm abiding in particular. When the 9th is achieved, one no longer need not strive to use the antidotes to laxity and excitement, and one attains a spontaneous abiding of the mind. So again, in your Lam Rim text, all 9 mental abidings are set out and descriptions of what happens at each of them. The 9th mental abiding is once more that final stage just before calm abiding. And at that point, you already have what's called spontaneous abiding, meaning that there's not there's no effort needed. You just spontaneously abide. You just like turn the mind towards it and you're there. You don't have to, kind of get the mind all revved up and doing everything it needs to do. So equanimity is kind of this quality that comes into play when we are able to abide in those kinds of states through these mental abidings. In general, there are 3 types of equanimity. And this is not 3 types of this mental factor of equanimity. This is going back to kind of the bigger picture. Because this word, we all know this word, right? Equanimity, we've heard it in the 4 immeasurables prayer, right? And we hear it in their bodhisattva training that you need a mind of equanimity as the basis for developing bodhicitta and so on. You might also hear about it in regard to being a feeling of equanimity, which is more or less a neutral feeling. So there are 3 different ways that equanimity is talked about. This is one of them. So it says in general, there are 3 types of equanimity. Equanimity of application, equanimity which is feeling, and immeasurable equanimity. From among these, this mental factor here is compositional equanimity. And in its essence, it means the first one, the equanimity of application. Equanimity, which is a feeling, is once more kind of a neutral feeling. We can talk about 3 different feelings. Remember when we went through feeling, mental factor feeling, we had pleasant, we had unpleasant, and then we had something that was neither, kind of neutral. So in many texts, that's called the feeling of equanimity. It just means that it's not moving in any particular direction, towards something pleasant, towards something unpleasant. So this would be one of those, that would be number 2, that's at the top of page 47. Number 3, immeasurable equanimity is what we know through our practice of equanimity as the thought of having an even-mindedness towards all beings, having an equal regard for all beings, and wanting others to have that same equal regard. Um, so I just got a little message here saying something about low system resources, but let's see if those folks who are online, maybe let me know by chat box if there's something that starts going amiss with the broadcast. So that's the third type of equanimity. The first one, the application, or what they're calling your compositional equanimity, is this ability to attain a state where the mind is kind of in that balanced state of not having to tend to any faults in the mind. Excitement and laxity are no longer arising, these two main faults, and you can just sort of hang out within that state of stable mind. So it says here, with regard to this is the top of page 47, with regard to this, one should understand the following in detail from the stages of the path to enlightenment. And these are all the topics that once more are covered within the calm abiding section, the 5th perfection of concentration in the Lam Rim. The stages of setting the mind on the object of observation on the occasion of the first mental abiding, which is called setting the mind, the system of relying upon the antidotes to laxity and excitement, up to the system of increasing abiding on the object of observation. Again, all the instruction for doing that is in the Lam Rim, so I'm not going to go through all of that. At those times, the system of relying on the antidotes to laxity and excitement, which are in the category of, if you have laxity, the dulling of the mind, then you need to heighten the mind. If you have the oversensitization of the mind where it's constantly bouncing around and distracted by excitement to various objects, then you have to withdraw the mind, bring the mind in. But there are different techniques for doing those. Finally, the system of achieving single-pointed abiding and meditative stabilization. So again, the entire system is set out. And just to give a plug to the Hindu culture, Hindu tradition, all of the meditative techniques that are set out in terms of developing these states come from the Hindu tradition. Prince Siddhartha went to study with all of these great meditation masters who came from that tradition, who gave him these amazing techniques to work with. And so it's the same system in a sense. It's just using that system not just to abide in those states of meditative stabilization, but to make them a platform for deeper realizations. The demarcation between whether or not it is necessary to be on the alert for laxity and excitement, which happens further along, because there will be a place where you don't need to apply any more antidotes because those faults aren't arising. Laxity and excitement aren't there. You've quelched them. You've gotten rid of them. And you can, kind of keep moving forward, developing, deeper concentration by kind of hanging out in that state of equanimity. The system for attaining equanimity and so forth. So again, all of these topics, I should have said squelched. I said quelched, squelched. I was putting two words together, I think there is something. Anyway, the function of equanimity is specified as not allowing an opportunity for afflictions because upon attaining the 9th mental abiding, the manifest afflictions of the desire realm are easily overcome. And in particular, laxity and excitation do not arise during meditative equipoise. So I'm kind of rushing through that, but once more, I don't know that I would really want to spend too much time going through all of that because it's all covered in the Lam Rim again. Yeah, Bob. Uh-huh. It seems so, but again, we would still say though that you probably have something approaching that at the times when you're abiding in a state where laxity and excitement aren't arising. So I wouldn't want to discount it. Bob's question, I'm sorry, for those who are online, was he said it sounds like you only have this mental factor of equanimity when you are on the 9th mental abiding or above. And I would say maybe in a fully qualified form, yes, but nonetheless, we can still talk about states where you have it momentarily. You just don't have it with the continuity that you would have at the 9th mental abiding and above. At least that's my impression based on the studies I've done. But So let's go through what Geshe Rabten says. Maybe he'll contradict me. We'll see. I don't recall everything that he said in his explanation in Mind and the Mind and its Functions. So let's go to that mental factor, equanimity. He says it's a distinct mental factor that, without having to exert a great effort to prevent excitement and sinking, does not let the mind be affected by them. It is a quality ascribed to a state of mind in which detachment, non-hatred, non-bewilderment, and enthusiasm, these four that we saw again earlier, are present. It has the function of settling and leaving the mind in rest upon a wholesome object. So again, I'm going to once more put up that chart that I had earlier that gives the full listing of all the faults, and we see equanimity coming into play as the very last fault that can be there. For most of us, we do not have this fault, again, because, is it there? Yeah, okay. Um, we don't have this fault yet because we're stuck up in this area. Maybe we're mostly dealing with laziness. But even when we go into meditation, we forget the instruction, meaning forgetting the object, and we need to be more mindful of the object. We forget to, or we don't have a very good identification when laxity and excitement are rising. Instead, we just kind of go off onto the traveling circus show, whatever, or we just completely fall asleep or whatever the case might be. So we tend to be mostly in this area of making sure that we do apply the antidotes, that when laxity and excitement arise, we identify them and we apply the antidotes. This fault only comes into play when we've pretty much squelched the laxity and excitement. We've kind of kept them from arising or gotten rid of them, and yet the mind has this tendency to think we need to be applying an antidote. Oh, there must be something going on because we've been dealing with the reality of those faults for so long. And so we need to, at that time, let go of that task. You can just hang out. You can glide in a sense, continue your meditation. Take your hands off the handlebars. All right, so that's kind of where this factor does come into play. So again, it would be in the higher range, certainly in terms of the 9 mental abidings when it becomes much more prominent. Furthermore, since the knowledge of ultimate reality, emptiness, only occurs when the mind is in a state of equipoise, equanimity is said to act as the basis for such knowledge. It's kind of interesting that until you have that equanimity, that sort of ability to just be in that balanced state and not have any, you know, if you can imagine again that, I guess these people who do tightrope walking have a way of finding that physically in their bodies. We're talking about that type of quality that you just can go forward. You don't need to, tend to falling one way or the other. And so again, this is something that will be a basis for achieving that knowledge. That actually having that equanimity is a support for that. In addition, it acts as a basis for the prevention of excitement and sinking, as well as all the other root and proximate afflictions. So if you have a mind that is hanging out in that balanced state, the afflictions aren't going to rise either, right? Because you're just not going to be reacting to things in that way. You're kind of free of the faults of that for the moment. It doesn't mean that, again, just attaining that gets rid of the afflictions, but it certainly diminishes their power and their ability to arise. In general, equanimity is the mental factor that keeps the mind balanced and calm without letting it become either carelessly distracted or unclear and dull. So carelessly distracted is referring to excitement in general, and being unclear and dull is the laxity, that side of it. Although it may be weak in an untrained mind, through the practice of constant meditation, it can be developed into a very powerful force. So he seems to reiterate what I was saying, that it can be weak in an untrained mind, meaning we have very few moments of equanimity. But with training, and as we move through, again, those 9 mental abidings, we would see that the equanimity becomes more of a force. Maybe becomes, as I said, we might even call it a fully qualified equanimity at later stages, because then it's actually able to hang out in that state and keep any of these other forces from arising. Okay, let's go through this last little bit that is Geshe Rabten's way of talking about this. I don't know that we need to go through this, but as long as I have the slides. Usually we speak of 3 types of equanimity. Equanimity that is a feeling. He calls it indifference. Again, it's more of a neutral feeling. Limitless equanimity or immeasurable equanimity, the wish for all beings to abide in a state of even-mindedness, free from attachment and hatred. And the equanimity that is a formative element. Here we're only referring to the 3rd type. Of course, in our presentation it was the first, but keep in mind that this is the Geshe Rabten's way of putting these 3 together. This is the equanimity that is a formative element. This has a specific 3-fold classification: the equanimity of a balanced mind, a mind at rest, and a spontaneous mind. So this is what we saw in our definition. It's kind of a balanced mind, a mind at rest, and a spontaneous mind. The equanimity of a balanced mind goes on to describe this a little bit more, is one that with exertion is able to maintain an equipoise, but otherwise is still subject to being interrupted by slight excitement or sinking. So this is kind of a preliminary state where we still have some subjectivity to the um, slight excitement, or what we might call subtle excitement and sinking or laxity. Then we have the equanimity of a mind at rest. We called that here a dwelling in a natural state in our definition, is able to concentrate on its object without having to make any great effort to apply the remedies for excitement and sinking. So this, I think, is somewhere around maybe the 7th or 8th mental abiding, I think 8th. And then we would have the equanimity of a spontaneous mind occurs when the mind is finally equipoised in concentration, which is the 9th mental abiding and above. It is a state in which even without any effort, excitement and sinking will definitely not occur. So it does seem from, again, Geshe-Rabtin's description that you're including different states of equanimity that would be, as you proceed and progress on the development of calm abiding. Yeah, Bob. Uh-huh. Yeah. 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 Equipoise. Yeah. Got a similar root to equanimity. Yeah, I think we had another definition for meditative equipoise in the text that we studied, the chapter 4 of the ornament. Yeah. 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 Yes. Yes. Yeah. So So again, Bob was just speaking to the use of that word equipoise in that slide, and the fact that we kind of gives a definition in a sense of what we mean by equipoise, and the ability to have that sustained equanimity, that is the support for realizations. Because yeah, meditative equipoise is referring to those meditative sessions where we are able to directly realize emptiness in that. So let's go on to the final of our virtuous mental factors, non-harmfulness. This is in some texts we're going to see, even I think it's in Geshe-Rabtin's, that it's called non-violence, which is not to say that like the philosophy of non-violence that Gandhi, abided by or something, though it has the same roots. It's essentially meaning a sort of an avoidance of harm. All right. So, what is non harmfulness? It is a mind of compassion and is involved with non hatred. It has the function of not inflicting injury. So, it's kind of interesting that they don't have compassion as a separate mental factor that's virtuous, but we would say that it's included within this mind of non harmfulness. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, the question was, is that ahimsa, the Sanskrit word for non-harmfulness? Just as it has been said above, non-harmfulness it's kind of interesting how here it calls it a patience. It called it a compassion earlier, now it's a patience. So you see there's a lot of qualities that are involved in non-harmfulness. It's a patience that, lacking malice, which again is the mind that wants to harm others, observes suffering sentient beings, thinking, may they be free of that suffering. This abandoning harm to sentient beings, or non-harmfulness, is the essence of the meaning of the conqueror's scriptures. And this is why we often say that ahimsa, or non-harmfulness, is really the essence of all of what the Buddha taught in terms of ethical behavior and virtue, how we engage in that. So there is this teaching from Sutra. Let's read this together. Patience is the supreme austerity. The Buddha said, patience is supreme nirvana. An ordained one who harms or injures another is not a trainee in virtue. So we see that again, patience plays a role in our lack of harm to others, our lack of giving harm to others, right? If we're patient in the midst of experiencing particularly the sufferings that others inflict upon us, the harm that they inflict upon us, then we will be capable of avoiding that harm. And so the mental factor that is the mind intent on not harming is a product of those things. Again, we can see it being influenced by compassion, influenced by patience, a lot of different things kind of feeding into it. But once more, to understand that this list, even of these 11 virtues, is not meant to be exhaustive. We wouldn't say that every single virtue is included in what we've looked at, but rather that the ones that needed to be highlighted from the point of view of our practice. So we see that non-harmfulness is really a key part of Buddhist practice, as it says there. An ordained one who harms or injures another is not a trainee in virtue. Anyone who really does that, we would say, is probably not, particularly at the moment, training in virtue. Obviously, we will have our times when we lose our cool and harm others through our speech or our physical actions. But even the conqueror's teaching in the context of bestowing a water strainer in the Vinaya procedural rite is a fine distinction of compassion. So again, there is one precept of the ordained where they are to strain their water before drinking it so that any creatures, small creatures that are floating in the water aren't harmed in the process of one partaking of that water. Since one must definitely turn away from harming others as well as their bases, meaning kind of their bodies, because again, the basis of a being is its body and mind, but primarily we would be doing harm to their, well, we could do harm to their minds too, but yeah. But certainly, this is trying to just make that delineation between the beings themselves and their bases. We don't want to harm either one. Obviously, when we harm the basis, we are harming the being to some extent too, but because of the interconnection between those two. But just highlighting that. The necessity of equipping oneself with a strainer for the sake of abandoning harm to creatures in water has been taught. So to not harm those beings in that way, this is why this was taught, even down to that level. To do that. And on the occasion of giving the instructions, one is cautioned about the necessity to abide in the four qualities that makes one a trainee in virtue. Let's read these four qualities. Even when derided, do not deride in return. Even when someone gets angry at one, do not get angry in return. Even when hit, do not hit back. Even when one's faults are exposed, do not expose others' faults. So these are kind of these are actually called, Venerable George says these are called the four activities of an ascetic. They're also very similar to one of the secondary bodhisattva vows, I think, where we are basically trying to, keep from responding in turn. If somebody does something to us, we just have an impulse to do the same thing back to them. They call you blah, 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 blah. You call them blah, 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 blah. Maybe call them worse than blah, 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 blah. All right. So this is kind of, again, our training in non-harmfulness is to not respond to harm with harm. So we can see the quality of patience definitely involved here. Therefore, if the intelligent ones analyze and understand this well, they will be able to understand that abandoning harmfulness is the essence of the teachings. So let's look at the what Geshe Rabten has to say about these. Let me share that with the folks online. Again, he used the same terminology, non-harmfulness, in, oh, I'm sorry, I should have changed that. No, that's fine. Non-harmfulness is what we're using. He does call it non-violence, as I mentioned earlier. He says it's a distinct mental factor that, lacking any intention to cause harm, considers if only sentient beings were separated from suffering. So we see it has that kind of compassionate wish behind it. It has the function of being unable to bear the suffering of others. In other words, non-violence is equivalent to compassion, the pure wish that others may be free from suffering. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, a question I might pose here, you can think about it. We don't need to debate it tonight because we don't necessarily have the time to debate it. But if you were engaging in not harming others out of the motivation because you didn't want to experience the negative karma of that, it was a self-centered concern. I don't want to experience, having my body harmed by harming this being's body. Would you have the mental factor of non-harmfulness present? Doesn't seem like it's fully qualified. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this is why, again, when we, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. So Jane is saying it's there, and so is ego, or so is, yeah, this heightened sense of self-concern. Yeah. Sure, sure. But it is the beginning of our path to a great degree, where we kind of give up on our attachment to the pleasure of this life and are willing to forego, whatever to, yeah, yeah, yeah. Anyway, just something for you to think about. Again, I don't want to get into too much of a discussion, but yeah. Okay. Were you going to say something? Yeah. Yeah. Right. But this is, yeah, this is in the context what Rowena is pointing out is kind of to get anywhere on the path, you have to kind of have a motivation that is to eventually get there. But that's within the context of those who have that whole path as their view. But anyway, if you had just somebody who like say that all that they were taught was, you know, you shouldn't kill beings because you're going to suffer in future life because of that, and that was the only teaching they were given. You know, they didn't have a context for, oh, this is also necessary for my becoming liberated, this is also necessary for my becoming enlightened and benefiting others. So I think that's what you were saying. Yeah. Anyway, I didn't, again, I'm sorry I put the question out there, but I think it's worthwhile taking a look at these and seeing, you know, when are they being cultivated? And I like what you said, Jane, that, you know, we're still a suffering sentient being too. We are looking at ourselves and not wanting ourselves to suffer. So in a sense, it's saying if only this sentient being were separated from suffering, you know. So maybe it is still non-harmfulness. I don't know that there's a definitive answer to this, but I think it's worth exploring. Yeah. Yeah, many mental factors operating. Yeah. Yeah, Bob, were you going to say something? Yeah, to harm yourself. Yeah. 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 Right. Right. Yeah. So so Bob was just pointing out that, yeah, in saying it lacks any intention to cause harm, we can think of that as harming ourselves, and so in that way it would qualify. Just this last part, he does say, you know, nonviolence is equivalent to compassion, the pure wish that others may be free from suffering. But that isn't really, you know, compassion is can be towards oneself too. So anyway, yeah, yeah, this is true. And future lives is another, certainly. So yeah. Furthermore, Geshe Rebden says, it acts as a foundation for the strong urge not to disrespect others by killing and hurting them, and for the desire to benefit and bring happiness to the weak. So again, just flavors to it. This is very similar to, again, those four uh, ascetic practices, you know, activities, ascetic activities to not harm others in the various ways in response to their harm. And then he goes on to give the delineation of the three compassions that I actually did a retreat on the three compassions. I think some of you were at that. That was the last group retreat that I did here in 2016. Um, there are three kinds of nonviolence or non-harmfulness: compassion referring to sentient beings, that referring to phenomena, and that referring to the non-referential. This is explained fully in the introductory verses of Master Chandrakirti's supplement to the Middle Way. Compassion, referring to sentient beings, is the compassion that arises from seeing creatures helplessly bound to samsara through the force of their ignorance, clinging to a self-existent person. So remember the analogy we had there, explained this in the retreat, was the bucket and the well, getting all banged about, you know, up from the lowest point to the highest point and everywhere in between. That's the first of the three types of non-harmfulness or compassion. The compassion referring to phenomena is the compassion that occurs when one sees the transient and permanent nature of sentient beings. And this, the example for that was the reflection of the moon in a water that is being rippled by the wind. So you have the constantly moving and changing. And so it's kind of beings conditioned by impermanence. Then finally, compassion referring to the non-referential is the compassion or non-observable that comes about when one sees that although sentient beings appear to inherently exist, in fact, they do not inherently exist. And this is the mere fact of the reflection of the moon in the water that is only a reflection. It isn't the actual moon, the way that things appear to be solid and real, but they lack that. And so again, we can see sentient beings in these three ways as kind of having the three different qualities that we could observe them on the basis of: that they are suffering, that they are impermanent, that they are empty of inherent existence. And those last two are definitely causes of a lot of their suffering, because they cling to themselves as if they were permanent and unchanging, and then they cling to themselves as if they were inherently existing, and they aren't. So we see that it kind of gets to a wisdom teaching in the context of compassion. So anyway, um, hopefully that refreshed a few people's memories of. Well, you could line them up to some degree, but I don't. But I don't think that they're completely meant to be aligned in that, because again, the first one encompasses. We could certainly look at all of the suffering. We're not only looking at them being conditioned. Rachel's question, I'm sorry for those online, was could you line them up with the three types of suffering: suffering of pain, suffering of change, uh, uh, pervasive compounded suffering. And to some degree you can, but I think the first one is talking about beings conditioned by whatever suffering is going on for them. The other two are really just to see them as, yeah, lacking any permanent or unchanging nature, and then also being empty of inherent existence. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I never thought about them in that regard, but thanks for bringing that up, Rachel. All right, so we didn't get to, it's 8:16 now, so we really should conclude. We didn't get to this kind of whole way of discussing the virtuous mental factors in terms of by way virtues by way of entity, which all of these are, virtue by way of relation, so on. I mean, and all of this goes on for a couple of pages, like I mentioned. Um, we'll talk about that a little bit when we reconvene, I guess. We've got quite a few months before I'm back here teaching again, but were there any questions on anything we talked about tonight? And you might look over that, having just gone through the virtuous mental factors. Don't just, put all these materials on a shelf and say, well, you've got 2 weeks now, right? Next Wednesday, it's great if you can come to the talk that's going to be given by Rachel about, working, having a geshe and all of that that's involved and what have you. But it's really good to, spend some time looking at this if you can. But I would encourage you maybe to read through that. And then when we reconvene in November, whatever probably be like the second Wednesday in November or something like that, or maybe first Wednesday in November, I don't know. Then we can go through all of that and continue on to talk about the afflictions. So, all right. Okay. Oh, you're welcome, Alan. You all are welcome. Uh, you have, uh, I will do my best. I hope I travel safe. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And yeah, well, I'm always happy to teach. I'm so glad. And this community is amazing, and I really, really appreciate the time that I have here, kind of being more stable and working with all of you on a regular basis. It's really fulfilling for me. And so, yes, continue to do your study and, yeah, come to Geshe-la's teachings. It's really important, especially to look at the Lam Rim. Those of you who haven't studied the Lam Rim, it's a really wonderful text to explore that. So, all right. So let's do some concluding prayers before we leave tonight. So, page 235. So, again, recall the motivation that you had at the beginning of tonight, really wanting everything we do tonight to be infused with bodhicitta, with this wish that we become enlightened quickly through practicing virtue in the ways that we're talking about. Through great effort and perseverance, being able to attain these levels of meditative stabilization, attain realizations, to become enlightened quickly for the reason of serving sentient beings, being a benefit to them, being focused on their welfare completely. So think that we're dedicating now for our attainment of that result, and thus for the attainment of enlightenment by all beings. And then recall bodhicitta in the second verse and how important it is that we continually strengthen that mind that is informed by many of these virtuous mental factors that we've talked about. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Page 244 for the brief long life prayers for His Holiness and Lama Zopa. As we recite these two prayers, think that we're creating the causes for all of our spiritual guides, all spiritual guides everywhere who are helping sentient beings to practice paths of virtue, to find happiness, to be free of suffering. for them all to have good health and long lives, and for us and others to never be parted from perfect guides in all of our lifetimes. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And finally, dedicate for those that you're holding in your heart right now. There are many beings who we can think of, those that we know individually who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died, as well as events in our world, places in our world where there's great suffering and strife. Think about all these beings and send this positive energy out to these beings in particular, thinking that it relieves all of their suffering and helps them to have all the causes for perfect happiness and peace. And may all beings find true peace and happiness through our efforts here tonight. Thank you all again, really. I'm so appreciative of particularly what's blossomed with this Wednesday class. I really like, it used to be some nights, those of you who weren't here, where you'd come in and there'd be 2 or 3 people, and I mean, we just keep persevering and doing the class, but it's great that we have so much interest in this course now and this type of study, because I think it's really important to do this type of. Venerable Rabina was quite adamant that we had to offer this here at some point. That's why I decided to teach this, actually, was because on her previous visit, not the one that just happened, but the one prior to that, she really emphasized the need for people to study minds and mental factors. And I think it was Charmaine who was nudging me to do it. Unfortunately, Charmaine's been so busy that she hasn't been able to attend a lot of the classes, and she's in Nepal right now. But anyway, I'm really appreciative that all of you were here on these Wednesday nights in particular. So